Gentlemen, good afternoon. A very warm welcome on behalf of all of us who have the privilege of living and working and worshipping in this cathedral. Welcome to Salisbury Cathedral. For those of you who don't know the city, I assure you it doesn't always rain. And when you return for a future visit, the sun will be out and you'll enjoy the close at its very best. To all of you, a very warm welcome. It's a huge pleasure for us to host this event, which honours the memory of our distinguished former neighbour and fellow worshipper, Sir Edward Heath. To you all, welcome. Now, this is church, so there have to be parish notices. And the notice is this: in the event of our needing to leave the building unexpectedly, please follow the directions of our stewards, who are attired in white sashes, and follow their directions to leave the building and assemble on the lawn at the west end. In the few moments before this afternoon's speakers are introduced, I invite you now with me to use the building for the purpose for which it was built, by being still, and if you're able to, by joining me in a prayer. God of all, in whose wisdom is the path of peace, and through whose guidance all right decisions are made, be with those who lead our world at this difficult and uncertain time. Strengthen their insight into what is best for the people. Give them courage to pursue the common good, that laying aside personal advantage, they may seek a future that will bring about the flourishing of all nations and the greater peace, freedom, and prosperity of our world. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Dean, thank you very much for your welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to this, our 6th annual Salisbury Edward Heath lecture. This is the first year we have staged the event in this truly splendid cathedral. First, I must make special mention of Wilson's solicitors, who have kindly sponsored this event. We are indeed most grateful to them for their support. Now, some of you may have been wondering about the music that has been played for us by Sam Bristow, the assistant organist. 2 of the pieces were played by Edward Heath during his successful assessment for his award of an organ scholarship at Balliol College, Oxford. One piece was to reflect Edward Heath's love for sailing, the Wagner is from the Meistersingers, and the final piece was played here during his funeral service in this cathedral on the 26th of July 2005. If any of you would like full details of the music played, please see me afterwards, and I've got a handout that I could give you. The Dean has already mentioned, should we have to evacuate the cathedral for any emergency, we will wish you all to gather together so we can account for everybody. Now, there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. 2 of the cathedral's stewards will have mobile microphones, and when you ask your question, if you're able to stand and also give your name, that would indeed be very helpful. When the microphone is passed to you, it will be switched on, so there's no need to look for the switch. Now, before we start, Peter Beatty, the chairman of the Sir Edward Heath Charitable Foundation, will say a few words of welcome to you all.
Thank you, Gordon, and thank you, Dean, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted on behalf of the Sir Edward Heath Charitable Foundation and the trustees to welcome you to what is the 6th annual Edward Heath Lecture. The 6th annual Edward Heath Lecture in, I think, 8 years. And in fact, today is our 3rd attempt at this particular gathering. This was originally to have been billed as an event to mark the 50th anniversary of Ken Clarke's entry into the House of Commons, and at the same time the 50th anniversary of the illustrious Heath 1970 to 1974 government. Well, we're only a few years late, but here we are. Of course, Lord Clarke of Nottingham requires no introduction, so I won't attempt it. We're delighted and honoured to have him here today. We've been trying for a very long time to get him here, and he has finally succumbed to our blandishments, which doubles our pleasure. He has, of course, a very distinguished supporting cast today. Robin Butler, Lord Butler, is, well, can I put it this way? He is probably supreme among mandarins. He served a trinity of prime ministers as cabinet secretary and a trinity of prime ministers as private secretary at one level or another. And if that doesn't convince you that he is Sir Humphrey's Sir Humphrey, then the fact that he is a Knight of the Garter and indeed was our 5th Edward Heath lecturer in 2019 ought to convince you. Vernon Bogdanor, of course, was a major figure in politics and government in the University of Oxford when I was a student, the best part of half a century ago. And he remains a major figure. He is currently a professor at King's College London, but he is also Emeritus Professor of Politics and Government at King's College London. Sorry, he is Emeritus Professor of Politics and Government in the University of Oxford and a Professor at King's College London. This is all, of course, to be tied together by a national treasure, which is Gyles Brandreth. And I think that he needs no introduction either, so I won't try, except to say that all our guests are most welcome, and we thank them for taking the time to come this afternoon. Just before I close and hand over to Gyles Brandreth to chair today's proceedings, I'd like to offer a word of thanks to the Dean and Chapter, the magnificent Cathedral staff, my own colleagues, particularly Jess and Ivan, but also my fellow trustees, Gordon, who you've heard from, and Anthony Teasdale, for putting today's proceedings together. Without them, it wouldn't have been possible. Moreover, I'd like to thank all of you for coming here today and hope that you enjoy the day's proceedings. And now over to Gyles. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, let us applaud Peter and all the people who have made this afternoon possible. Brilliant. My name is indeed Gyles Brandreth, and if you're wondering why I am here this afternoon, if you're wondering why I'm here today, then already we have something in common. I'm delighted to be here, excited to be here. When I was a small boy, my mother was very keen that I should become an actor. She saw me as an actor. But even as a little boy, I wanted to be Prime Minister. There may even be people here today who rather wish that I was Prime Minister. But anyway, I then, having gone through that phase, wanted to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. And when I was about 10, I do remember conducting a wedding between my sooty puppet and my sweep puppet. This was many years ago, and I like to think was probably the first Anglican gay marriage. I did become an actor, not very successfully. My first big role, when I was very young, too young, was Hamlet. And it did not go well. It was here, in Salisbury, in fact. Not the present theatre, the old theatre used to have. It was not a success. The audience didn't like it, the critics didn't like it. In fact, the audience came prepared not to like it. They threw eggs at me. Yeah, went on as Hamlet, came off as omelette. Thank you. We are gathered here today to remember Edward Heath and to actually use this opportunity to think about the world now and the world as it was. And we could not have a more exciting or distinguished cast. After we've spoken to our principal guest, I'm going to be introducing to you the civil servant who has more experience of high office than anyone else alive, and my favorite historian, who is also the most distinguished historian alive. There was to be another one here, but he's got COVID, so I'm able to say that without fear of contradiction. So they are coming up later, but first you're going to meet a most remarkable man. I was a member of Parliament for a brief while. I was a member of Parliament until the people spoke. And I mean, obviously, I only served one term, and by the time my term came to an end, I knew by then I had contempt for my constituents. It just came as a bit of a surprise to find the feeling was entirely mutual. But while I was a member of Parliament, for me, the greatest privilege of being a member of Parliament was serving Kenneth Clarke. I was a parliamentary private secretary in his office for a while, and eventually I became the Treasury Whip when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. And so over a period of several years, week in, week out, sometimes day in, day out, I watched him at work. And his coolness, his intelligence, his understanding of the world, his good sense under pressure, and his huge kindness to everybody who worked for him, with him, and around him, even those with whom he disagreed. I was actually in the room when, so expansive was he at lunch, while removing a cigar from his mouth, that actually his shirt buttons popped, and one of them pinged the left ear of Michael Portillo. So that everything he does is done with a purpose. So he is a great and a good man. And for me, the excitement of today is being here to honor the memory of Ted Heath, who I was lucky enough to meet when I was a student, and my wife and I were lucky enough to know in later years, to honor his memory, but in the presence of one of the most experienced and remarkable politicians of our time. Please, ladies and gentlemen, would you welcome Kenneth Clarke?
Well, Gyles, thank you very much for that introduction and for the marvelous story about a meeting with Michael Portillo, which I don't recall at all, my buttons pinging off, but that doesn't surprise me, but it was a very, very kind introduction. Thank you very much for coming. And I'll begin by apologizing to all ladies and gentlemen for the fact that I'm going to have to deliver this sitting down. I'm now extremely lame. I can't stand for more than a minute or two at a time, so I hope the acoustics are not made worse by the fact that I'm sitting here addressing you all, but very grateful to see you all. I've been saying since I arrived, this is probably the last speaking engagement I shall do. I've stopped accepting them for some time, mainly because of my disability. And I agreed to this. I was talking to doing this 3 years ago, and they've never released me. COVID came along, all cancelled, all postponed. 3 years later, I was finally called upon to deliver my word to some very good friends of mine and old colleagues. Here I am, and they've laid on a cathedral, a rather grand setting for my last address to an audience, and of course an extremely distinguished audience, and an opportunity to do what I'm afraid I've been encouraged to do ever since today started, and the transport here started, wallowing in nostalgia for the very early days of my political career when I was an acolyte of Edward Heath and a follower of his as a parliamentary candidate, and one of the gains from Labour that gave him his majority in 1970, and an extremely minor acolyte and bag carrier as a member of his government. But I've been asked this question by the Trust. When I look back to those great and historic days, what are the lessons I think we should draw between then and now? And I don't know whether that was really intended to try to tempt me to get into really entertaining you, giving you my views about the state of politics, state of the Conservative Party, state of the government now, and all things that every journalist is always dying to get me to give an opinion on. But I try to address it in terms of TED and in terms of Europe, his big issue, his great cause in life, and one of my great causes in life. And what are the lessons to be drawn? The first true answer is not many. The culture of politics is totally transformed since the early 1970s. Politics, professional politics, Parliament, the public debate, totally changed. Those are the days of the class-based parties, almost parodies of what you thought they were like. The Conservative Party had masses of minor aristocrat sons and landed gentry and the establishment, masses of very distinguished lawyers. The Labour Party was the party of the working class, blue-collar movement, lots of trade unionist members, the miners' group who'd been working down the pit before they became MPs, 30-odd of them in the House of Commons. The public were very deferential to the politicians and voted in family lines and traditional lines with tiny swings indicating changes of opinion. And I won't go on. The whole way in which Parliament was debated was very different. The mores of the media were different. It has changed in many ways, sometimes for the better. Parliament was more powerful in those days. The government lived in this teeming village which gathered every evening when we'd finished earning our living during the day, in my case as a young lawyer. And the ministers teamed with us all the time, and there was a great feedback between backbenchers and ministers. But there were rogues, there were crooks, there were people whose private life shocked even me when I discovered what it was and got into the whip's office. None of that was shared with the public. There was a kind of muerta. The political lobby knew who the crooks were, but they didn't think the public were ready for all that. It was years later, the Profumo scandal, that we started being prepared for today's expose of even casual remarks to give the public the cynical conviction they all have now that every politician in this country is a scoundrel in it for what she and he can get out of it. So it's all changed. But I won't use up my 10, 15 minutes I've been lectured to take with just that reflection on the differences. Let me go back to the great political issue. What can we learn about the fate of Europe, which I was an acolyte of Ted Heath because I was a great follower of his and quite converted to his deep, deep conviction about Europe. After Suez, my generation of those in the Conservative Party, the new Conservative Party that was emerging, following Ted, was modernizing Britain. Suez had shown how absurd we were in trying to work out our place in the role, how left behind we were economically and politically in the shambles of the 1960s by the countries of Europe, some of whom we'd defeated, who are now overtaking us, going to the modern world. And we were going to shake Britain out of its obsession with reliving its past and its obsession with the loss of empire and give it a role in the modern world. And that issue, very important to me, it moved on by the 1990s to be my belief in a globalized world and a rules-based international order in which European powers like ourselves exercised our power in the world by being one of the leading lights militarily, politically, and economically in the Union. It rose, it flourished. For the time being, it's near dead. And I look back to the start and say, what are the lessons for pro-Europeans for what happened when we went in, what's happened recently, how it was handled? How did the political system make such a meal of it all and ultimately a mess of it? Well, I think it was partly the discipline of the pro-Europeans, the people who followed Ted and others at the time. The reason it caused such turmoil in British politics was from the start, it split the British political parties. The two great broad-based parties could never agree within themselves about Europe. It's the hardline right on the whole, which isn't obviously an absolutely rigid rule, but the majority of them fiercely anti-Europe. The hardline left, the majority of them fiercely anti-Europe. In my House of Commons, Jeremy Corbyn, as much a Brexiteer throughout his entire career as Bill Cash, and everybody liked them, allied. And it was the centre-left, the centre-right, the moderate centre, those who are now politically homeless in 2022, who actually were throughout the driving force behind Britain's attempt to get involved in the European project. And that instantly broke out in the first parliament I went into. I went in 1970. I was PPS to Geoffrey Howe in 1971 and got immersed in working with him and observing mainly him and the officials. He did first the Industrial Relations Bill, when we tried to curb union power, but then got involved in the European Communities Bill, taking us into Europe. And actually, after the second reading, I was then put into the whip's office as the most minor, youngest junior acolyte in the entire government in order to help get a majority for the European Communities Bill through Parliament. We got the majority, with difficulty. But there was never a Conservative parliamentary majority for joining. Majority of Conservatives did, but there weren't enough of us to carry it. It was the pro-European Heathites and the pro-European Jenkinsites who, between us, had a majority against, in the Conservative Party, the old imperialists who were still cursing my hero Ian MacLeod for giving away the empire and thought our role and future was in the Commonwealth and on our own, and the hard left of the Labour Party who could see it was a capitalist plot. Howard Wilson sat on the fence and pretended to be neutral. He was pro-European, really. But the parties divided. And when we had a vote in principle on joining, well over 100 Jenkinsites defied the whip, I think, certainly the majority of their party, voted with the Heathite majority of the Conservative Party, and we started the huge process of a bill. Now, after that, it became tricky because in those days, everything was filibustered. Debates on a bill like that took weeks and weeks, well into the night, into the small hours of the morning, on and on with votes. The Jenkinsites could not vote with us all the time because they feared being deselected by the activists in their constituency. So they used to take it in turns to abstain and fail to turn out. I finished my reminiscing about these distant things in my days in the whip's office. I could tell you much, much more. But one of my particular roles, because I knew some of the newer members, was to negotiate with one of the Labour MPs the number of Labour MPs we wished to fail to turn up tomorrow because of the scale of the rebellion we were going to have on the next great issue that was being raised in the bill. We nearly made a mistake. We used to negotiate. He would think I was overdoing it. I would bid him up. I think we got down to a majority of 4 was the nearest we got to losing it. But throughout it all, I was a silent listener to the debate. It was a magnificent quality of debate. The best speakers were on the anti-European side. Michael Foot, Enoch Powell, Tony Benn, they were some of the most brilliant orators I've heard in my life. But it was the cross-party, guided by the national interest consensus that got us through to delivering Ted's great dream of taking us into the European Union. Now, in the interest of time, I can't go back anymore. I confine myself to that and contrast it with what happened when we got to the other end, when for the second time we had a referendum, an opinion poll for party management reasons, as Cameron explained, to get the Eurosceptics to shut up about Europe and get off Europe and say he could win the election by campaigning on other things, and we lost it. And how did the pro-Europeans behave then? I'm afraid we did nothing to organize ourselves, and we didn't, of course, with the House of Commons hopelessly divided, we went into that dreadful, dreadful period of first impasse, total deadlock, a ludicrous election which made deadlock even more complete, until eventually the hardliners took control and we wound up with a hard Brexit. The pro-Europeans were divided, and it was the pro-Europeans that wrecked it. In my opinion, and this is the only original political point I have time to make, it was the second referendum campaign, to which many people in this room no doubt belonged, that actually wrecked any prospect of a soft Brexit. There were so many shades of opinion. I mean, Keir Starmer was a pro-European but saddled with a hardline Brexiteer leader. Both of them fudged their views, and Keir tried all the time to steer. He was actually a second referendum man, very keen. But a lot of Conservatives became second referendum people and would not vote for any deal with the other Europeans that was not tied to a second referendum. The result was that every time the issue came up, the hardline right, the European Research Group, and the pro-Europeans, hardline pro-Europeans second referendum group voted together as an unbeatable majority against every soft Brexit solution that Theresa May was able to come up with. Not all of them. Boris Johnson voted at least once, the third time, I'm sure he did, the same way as me, for the third of Theresa's convictions. But Boris was never a real Brexiteer by conviction anyway. But the others stayed where they were and took us to deadlock, led to the election where Boris was thrust to the leadership of the Conservative Party, and he won on a combination largely anti-Corbyn, bit of anti-immigration, otherwise just get Brexit done and get the boring debate over, which appealed to the real public mood by then after 2 years of bedlock. In my own defense, I voted against Article 50 to satisfy my conscience. I was against leaving the European Union. I'd always said against it. I'd made it clear that I wasn't going to change my lifelong convictions because of a rather silly 3-week campaign and an opinion poll on a question that most of the public weren't really terribly interested in itself, but where they were able to express rage at the political establishment and various things they thought were happening. To my amazement, I found I was the only Conservative who voted against Article 50. The most amazing devout Conservatives voted in favour of it because they'd signed up to the blasted referendum. Thereafter, I voted for a soft Brexit, minimise the damage. Margaret Thatcher would never have broken the trading links with Europe. She believed in economic Europe. That's why she helped lead the way to the single market. She'd have gone for the Norwegian solution or something of that kind. But I'm afraid the political system didn't work in that policy way. I've kept off all the more topical stuff about how the political system, in my opinion, is not working satisfactorily on a whole lot of fronts at the moment, in other ways as well. But we Remainers, pro-Europeans, didn't hang together and gave the hardliners the majority that put the most extreme form of Brexiteers in power and gave us the economic disaster as well as the political disaster that we have at the moment, because it is one reason we're doing worse than any other member of the G20 except Russia, and our outlook is so dire in one of the worst economic crises I can remember in my lifetime, if not the worst, is because we've had Brexit, COVID, and the Ukraine war doing damage to us, and we're only now facing up to the prospects of what we can do to minimize the depth of the recession and cope with it. So there we are. If Ted were here today, he'd be horrified to see it. His great dream of Britain's future place in the world had gone, and he probably would need a bit more explanation than the rather potted version I have given to a contemporary audience who've lived through it, of what I think brought it to such an unsatisfactory end in Parliament. But the one thing I haven't lost is my conviction that if Britain is to have any sensible influence in the world, to be respected, it's got to be seen as one of the leading political members of the bloc. Heath always saw it as a political project more than an economic project. I do, but it's both. The economy, the trading links, my belief in free trade and its benefits help create the things that get a confederation of nations, not a federation, but a pact of nation states, bond of nation states to hold together, exercise influence in the world for liberal democracy, the rule of law, and the values we hold important. And what we must do now is stop this ludicrous situation at the moment, continuing trade war, Jacob Rees-Mogg trying to find more differences we can make in our standards of goods, health and safety, food safety, veterinary standards, so we can put some more trade barriers between ourselves and the rest of Europe, thereby creating more political ill will between ourselves and our natural allies in a dangerous world. If we had to pull back from that and get back to a sensible, closely allied relationship with the European Union, which is the only feasible objective we have, it's not from me and old veterans who encouraged to come here and start reminiscing. It's too late for my generation to do anything about it. I hope people 30 years younger than me and younger than that are now thinking what they can do to put back our relations with Europe somewhere nearer to Ted Heath's vision all those years ago, and somewhat better for the public interest of the future. So there we are. I think Tony may have wanted me to give a host of extraordinary anecdotes, some of which we've been laughing about whilst preparing, but I apologize. It's, I say, the last public speech engagement of this kind that I shall certainly accept. I'm not overcome, but I've been given for the first time in my life a congregation in a quite staggering cathedral, probably with acoustics which mean that about a third of the audience have not really been able to a word that I've said. I hope I haven't been too earnest, but the 50 years have been quite remarkable and wholly dominated by the great cause which dominated Ted's life to exclusion of practically everything else, his belief that Britain's future and the national interest best lay in being one of the leading lights in Europe, something he did so much to promote when his rather unusual and extraordinary premiership all those years ago. He was a strange man whose entourage to be a minor acolyte in, but certainly on the big things, he was a visionary in politics for all the right things, and I'm glad Salisbury remembers him.
Well done.
How long did I go on for?
Just right. To the minute.
No, it wasn't.
Yes.
How long did I go on for?
They're still applauding. They love you. Oh, yes. Look at that. This is a proper ovation.
So no, she
Wow.
get.
My goodness. That was rather... Thank you for that wonderful ovation.
Very kind and polite audience.
No, very, very kind, very impressed. You certainly cheered me up. Well, can you, before I turn to the others, you said you knew Ted, and I would just like, because you were not personal there, but I would just love you to share with us what he was like as a person, your first recollections of meeting him.
I hesitate because Robin saw far more of him than I did.
We're coming on to Robin in a moment, but you're centre stage.
I did know him.
Yeah,
I knew him. I came to Salisbury to have lunch with him once or twice after he'd retired. But I was I was just one of the newly elected MPs who was one of his acolyte followers. He was one of the most peculiar personalities I have ever met in my life as a man. I think the other strangest personality I ever met in my life was Margaret Thatcher, but not in the same way. Ted had no social graces. He was gauche. He was a good public speaker. Private conversation, he had strange mannerisms. He wasn't gregarious. He could never really relate with people. He had no small talk, whatever. And the only thing he would talk about intensely was if you were talking about politics, where then he'd occasionally unwind, but it was obvious that you agreed. Because I first met him, he used to come and speak often to student meetings when I was an extremely active Conservative student in the Cambridge Conservatives and in the National Student Conservatives. He would always come along. But he would lecture us, he would try and lead us, he would try and inspire us, but he just could not relax. And there'll be strange silences in conversation when he would stop. And because he was Prime Minister, I'm coming along as Prime Minister now, one would pause. And he wouldn't say anything. And nobody would hear. And then he'd just resume the conversation as if nothing had happened. So he was a very strange man to relax with. And only occasionally, he liked the whip's office. He was extremely proud of having been chief whip for so many years, extremely proud of having led the party through Suez from the whip's office, and kept wanting to know what we were doing. We saw far more of him than a whip's office would expect to do of a prime minister, and he worked closely with Francis Pym, the then chief whip, who was more subtle than Ted, in making sure we kept our majority in one piece. But he used to boast about how he'd been chief whip at the time of Suez and kept the party together and delivered a majority. And he liked sitting down and chatting to us, all reservations for conversation. He would relax on subjects that I couldn't talk to him about. He would suddenly relax if anybody started talking who knew about anything about it, about music or yachting. I was just a mere spectator 2 or 3 times in seeing a totally different personality unwind. I think when I came to have lunch with him at Arundel's here in Salisbury, occasionally there were friends from that background also at the lunch. And then he would suddenly become a human being and start melting and interrelate. So that's the nearest I can give. I'm not good at giving psychological insights, but he was the most, and it did, of course, when he got into trouble, mean he was hopelessly wooden when it came to defending his leadership when he lost it after he was finally defeated in 1974. You couldn't possibly campaign for him to carry on because he didn't know how to do it. Most of the newly elected members who come in with me in 1970, by 1975, he'd never spoken to them in their lives. He'd never acknowledged their existence. Left that to the whip's office. Trying to get him to campaign amongst them was a complete waste of time. And so he was a complicated personality, but he was straight, he was honest, principled, and driven in politics by his views, which happen, in my opinion, to be the most civilized kind, one-nation conservatism driven by, above all, a political vision, Britain's role in the world in Europe.
Do you share that characterization, Robin?
Yes, I do. I think I'd better give you, as it were, Sir Humphrey's perspective on him, what it was like working in Number 10, or actually Bernard's perspective, since I was a junior private secretary, and I worked out, actually, that as it happens, I think, certainly this month, maybe even today, it's exactly 50 years since I went into Number 10 under Ted as a young and nervous civil servant. And as Ken said, he was not socially easy to deal with, and especially if you were young and nervous. I remember the first time I had to go and put an issue to him, sitting upstairs in his flat. I was on duty in the evening. We had a rota in the evenings, and I went up to the flat, slightly breathless from climbing the stairs. Ted was playing Wagner really very loudly. And so I waited for a moment, but he showed no disposition to turn the Wagner off. And so I started as best I could to explain to him the issue. And I stumbled through it. The Wagner continued, and Ted didn't react at all. And I thought to myself, well, you know, he's listening to the opera. So I started again. And after a few moments, I was sort of halfway through it for the second time, he gave me a complete answer to the point that I'd given to him, again, never turning the Wagner off. Now, I think that I discovered a way of dealing with this, because I adopted his technique. I used to travel in cars with him to events, and I would say something to him, and he would say absolutely nothing at all. And so I decided that I would adopt the same approach. And so I said nothing at all. And then eventually he would say something, and so again I would say nothing at all, and then I would say something. Anyway, we passed car journeys very happily in this way, and I became extremely fond of him. And the characteristic that I most remember was he had this glaze over his eyes when he looked at you. But every so often, perhaps once every 2 or 3 weeks, the glaze would clear, and he would look at you in a way that showed he not only liked you, but needed you. And I found that very, very beguiling. I remember particularly, just as an example of one great kindness, it was my job when I first went into his office to brief him for parliamentary questions, and then, after the question session, to go up to Hansard and check the Hansard. And on one occasion, he made quite an important political mistake. The question was about unemployment, and he made the point that a lot of the figures on the unemployment register were on what was called the temporary list of people who, for one reason or another, were out of work. And Ted added the words, most of them being on strike. Now, that was actually untrue, and it was very provocative to the Labour Party. And so when I went up to correct Hansard, I said to the editor, I persuaded the editor, and the editor should never have agreed that these words should come out. And of course, the next day, the Labour Party, who were in an excitement about this, checked Hansard and found that the official record had been tampered with. And they made a big fuss. And Ted had to go to the House of Commons and make a personal statement apologizing for this. Well, of course, I thought my career was at an end. And as he came out of the chamber, I fell in beside him. I said, "Prime Minister, I'm terribly sorry to have caused you such an embarrassment." And he looked at me just with a half smile and he said, "Don't do it again." And that was the sort of thing that bound you to him forever. And I believed in what he was doing. I think he was what I understand to be a one-nation conservative. He was a child of the 1930s. He'd been through the war. That molded his attitude both to society and to Europe. And he really believed that the problems of the British economy could be solved if employers and trade unionists could work together. And that's what he tried to do. And of course, as a result of the miners' strike, he eventually failed. But he was a serious man. As Ken said, he was a straight man. He was an honest man. Number 10, incidentally, was completely different from what we understand it to be today. It was like a gentleman's club or even a monastery. We were all men. All the private secretaries were men. The parliamentary private secretary, Tim, was a man. The press secretary was a man. The appointment secretary was a man. There were a couple of sort of senior ladies who kept the show on the road, but we were all men. But it was a serious place, and we were a family. We had a feeling of family, and we worked together. And if there's one thing in my career that I feel proud of, 7 years after he left office, I was interviewed by Margaret Thatcher to be the principal private secretary in Number 10. And I just felt I had to say to her, I'd love to do it, but I've got to tell you, I believed in what Ted Heath was doing. And she gave me a frosty look. And then she said, "That's not what I've got against you. What I've got against you is that you came to Chequers once and you told us that inflation was inherent in the British economy and couldn't be eliminated, and we better learn to live with it." She said, "I've never heard such a shocking remark made by a young man." But she gave me the job, and I'm very glad that I did up front with her that I believed in Ted.
We're with living history here, aren't we? I hope they'll walk among you later so you may touch their garb. Let's bring in Vernon now. Ken began by saying that the culture has changed in 50 years. The political culture, the worlds are completely apart. Is he correct, or is this his assessment from the fact that he lost the argument in the long run? That's the other way of putting it. Has the culture changed? Is that what's to blame?
Of course it has, and someone once said history doesn't repeat itself, but historians often repeat each other. I'm at a disadvantage here because I was only a very distant acquaintance of Ted Heath, but like the other two speakers, I greatly liked and admired him. And oddly enough, I never found these difficulties in conversation, which the other two speakers have mentioned.
This
perhaps,
is because you're so cultured.
No, it's perhaps because I'm interested in music, it's true. But he once came to my college when I was a young man in the late 70s, after he ceased to be Prime Minister. A group of the younger fellows asked him if he'd come to a fairly scratch buffet dinner, it has to be said, not at the high table, and talk about his views. And he came and we had a most interesting conversation. He was enormously impressive, and he argued one-to-one as equals with these we were very sort of wet behind the ears people, and it was very, very impressive. And perhaps I should say one other story. When I came recently to Arundel's to talk to the European People's Party group in the European Parliament, and the chap who opened the door, who was looking after the house, had been there a long time, and I said, "You must have known Ted Heath." And he said, "Yes." He said, "Heart of gold, that man, sir, heart of gold." And I think that is interesting. Robin Butler told a very interesting story about Margaret Thatcher and Heath, and I think I can complement that from a story Robin's predecessor, Robert Armstrong, told me. He was also very close to Heath and greatly admired him. And when he was Cabinet Secretary, he had a photo of Edward Heath on his desk. And when he was appointed Cabinet Secretary, he said he told Margaret Thatcher, "I am a close friend of Edward Heath's. Would you like me to end that friendship?" And she said, "No, and I would think less of you if you did," which I think casts great credit on her. And there's also a story about inflation, which perhaps is worth telling, because an honorary fellow of my Oxford College was Geoffrey Rippon, who was a member of the Heath cabinet. And he said to me that he told Edward Heath during the government that he feared inflation was a greater danger at that time than unemployment. And Heath replied rather roughly, "Why can't you be loyal like Margaret?" Of course, the big spenders of the Heath government were Margaret Thatcher and Keith Joseph. And that government, for better or worse, had much higher than average increases in annual rates of spending on education and health than the previous Labour government of Harold Wilson. You may think that's a good thing, you may think it's a bad thing, it's a fact. On Europe, Robin Butler's quite right that Heath's views were formed in the 1930s by high unemployment at home and fascism abroad. And he was one of the few conservatives who supported the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War against Franco, and was also hostile to the Munich Agreement with Harold Macmillan, and they both supported a Popular Front candidate in a famous Oxford by-election against the official Conservative candidate, who was Quintin Hogg, later to be called Lord Hailsham. And the great Oxford philosopher after Munich, J.L. Austin, had an election poster which said, "A vote for Hogg is a vote for Hitler." And the historian A.J.P. Taylor said that was the only proposition of Austin's that he ever understood. Heath's approach to Europe, I think, was based very much on his own experience. And his three triumphs before he became Prime Minister were all triumphs of authority. At the time of Suez, resale price maintenance, and then the third triumph, getting into Europe. Now, two of those three, the Suez one was within a framework decided by others. And the negotiation, which won him plaudits, a failed negotiation, nevertheless won him plaudits until de Gaulle's veto in 1963, was also in a framework decided by others. And it's interesting that it's now clear he was opposed to Suez, but was a very loyal lieutenant of the government in carrying out. And I think this gave him the view that firm leadership secured the policy you wanted, that if you lead firmly enough and your case is sensible and rational, people will follow. And it's interesting, the only area outside Parliament of which he had much experience was the military. His background was the army and the Tory whip's office in the 1950s, where people broadly fell into line in the last resort if you could persuade them. There was a large military element in the Tory party then, and I think Ted Heath found it very difficult to understand how trade union leaders and others with different backgrounds viewed such authority. And I think that was one of the difficulties he faced. And I think he also faced a difficulty in Europe in signing up to something whose complexities were not at that stage very clear. But it's often forgotten that the British commitment to monetary union was made by Heath and the other European leaders in 1973. And I just wonder whether the complexities of it had been thought through. And we all remember the damage, or most remember the damage the ERM caused in Britain and difficulty the Euro's causing to many European countries. And I've come to sympathise, though I didn't at the time, with John Major's view in the 90s that it was too early for Europe to have the common currency. But it was an extraordinary leap for Ted Heath to believe the British in 1973 could support a common currency by the year 1980. And people have often said that Ted Heath was a futurist, that he was a strategist who saw in the future. I just wonder whether his future of social partnership with the trade unions and a deep commitment of Britain in Europe was ever actually plausible. Sorry to end this part of it on a negative note. As I say, I greatly liked and admired him and supported him at the time. I agreed with him at the time, I have to say.
To help you not end on a negative note, before we bring on everybody for a conversation, I'd like to ask each of you, what we're really here, we've got to focus on, is the lessons of the 1970s for today. Does history teach us anything from then that could apply now? In a sentence, Vernon.
Yes, it does, to critically examine your assumptions, for example, about the trade unions. Could they ever be social partners? Had they ever been? Their job was to get the most for their members. They weren't going to be part of the state. They weren't going to be brought in. Could a long-term incomes policy ever be effective? It hadn't been under the previous Labour governments. Why should the Conservatives find it easier to establish an incomes policy with the trade unions? Then Heath also wanted to raise the rate of growth in Britain to 5%. Now, we hadn't had such a rate of growth since the mid-19th century. What was different about the Britain of the 1970s that made it plausible? So I think there are lessons of history if you critically examine your assumptions and look at the backgrounds of the people you're dealing with, particularly those in the trade unions and the functions of trade unions.
Thank you. And Robin, what one lesson do you pick out from your early days that might help us in the world now?
Then, politicians were interested in government. Today, they're too interested in politics. And it's not just altogether their fault, because, as Ken said, the world has changed. The world has changed with 24/7 media and with social media. But even so, it's not as good. It's not as good as it was. Government isn't as good as it was. It's become more difficult, and I'm glad that I'm not in it today.
Oh, well, we're sorry you're not in it today. We now have an opportunity for people to ask questions, and do ask questions rather than making points. If we've got this amazingly distinguished galère here, and we've got 2 microphones, and young, able, ready to come forward. So if you've got a question you'd like to ask, this is the moment to ask it. Is somebody asking a question or just walking out? We understand. Yes? Please wave, tell us who you are and who in particular you're addressing.
My name is Ian Johnston. We've come all the way from East Hampshire. It's an absolute privilege to be here and to receive some wonderful experiences, and thank you very much. My question really relates to inflation in the 70s and the reaction of the governments to it, with interest rates generally being above the rate of inflation in order to tame it. Where do you think interest rates are going in the 2020s?
The Chancellor of the Exchequer is here to answer the question. Where are interest rates going? He's obviously looking at his portfolio and wanting some free advice.
Well, the Heath government was a bit of a disaster for economic policy, as has already been said. He took too much notice of a man called William Armstrong, who was Permanent Secretary to the Treasury, who introduced all the ideas. Although the problems had all started in the 1960s, the first clash, inflation, clash between trade unions and the government and so on, the rising power of the trade unions had started then. But we went for statutory prices and incomes policy, which was a complete nonsense. And we went for the dash for growth, as you said, with a rather weak Chancellor, a very nice chap, but it was totally compliant with everything that his Prime Minister told him to do, which is a disaster for any Chancellor under any Prime Minister. However, I had a good Prime Minister in John Major, but I didn't let him tell me what to do. But to be fair to the Heath government, we had the first oil crisis, and energy prices surged, and that finally put the tin lid on the dreadful inheritance we handed on to Harold Wilson. The public were already suffering from the industrial strife, the rising inflation, and the disruption that we'd caused. So that wasn't. Now, what was the second part, which is what you were interested in?
Interest rates going now.
Interest rates are going up now. The Bank of England is rather slow off the mark, I think. But again, going up, as I said, it is no good going back and learning the lessons of the 1970s. The only lessons from the 1970s and thinking that 2022 is the same. Life does change. Old goffers have to accept that the problems are different, and so you can't just start reliving what you thought the answers were all those years ago. I'm tempted to go back to the 1990s, the great normality, when I think we were hugely successful in getting, led by Paul Volcker of the Fed in the United States, in getting rid of hyperinflation and then getting back, Britain certainly, to growth, sustainable growth with low inflation, which we handed on to the Blair government. But the problems are different now. But at the heart of them, inflation is a problem of demand and supply. The principal duty of the Bank of England is to act, to curb demand, when obviously particularly when you're about to go into that dreadful cycle, which we did in the 1970s, of wages chasing prices, driving prices up, wages chasing prices again. Bank of England has the main instrument, not the only one, to stop that. And meanwhile, the government's got to stop pumping more and more money into the economy than it absolutely has to in the essential areas, particularly relieving the poor, and only the poor, from the effects of hyperinflation. But we are going to have high inflation. Interest rates are going to have to be put up forcefully by the Bank of England with caution for the next few months. I think we're almost certain to have a recession. Circumstances of such high inflation, such tight labor markets, at the same time, all the pressures on oil prices, international political pressures, also driving up fuel prices, food prices, so on. The British economy is going to have a very, very severe recession, and raising interest rates is one of the things that should have started sooner, has to happen, and as the Fed has now realized, central banks in the West are going to have to get on with it, and some central banks elsewhere as well.
That's the answer. There's a lady, I think, a few rows in front. Oh, yes, next person.
Thank you. Stephen Gash, formerly Chairman, Bexley Heath Young Conservatives. On Friday, the 19th of June 1970, our newly re-elected member for Bexley stood on the steps of 10 Downing Street and said, and I quote, "To govern is to serve. Our purpose is not to divide, but to unite, and where there are differences, to bring reconciliation, to create one nation." Despite all the difficulties and challenges that Ted's government faced in his nearly 4 years in office, to what extent do you think he achieved those noble one nation ambitions of June 1970?
I'm going to ask Robin first. I know you were only a civil servant at the time, but those were the ambitions. Do you think they were achieved?
Well, I think Ted, it was what motivated him. He wanted to see us as one nation in which we all work together. And of course, in the short term, it failed. But when later the trade unionists decided, and they were helped by the legislation, but not only by the legislation, this was a decision of trade unionists. They were helped, of course, by having secret ballots. That made a great deal of difference. But the penny had dropped, I think. And so the reason that some of the most militant trade union leaders didn't get a following from their members was because of the lesson which was learned in the early 1970s.
Good. I'm going to get as many people in as possible, please. Yes? Oh, good.
Christine Glover from Amesbury. I wanted to ask Sir Robin if he thought that the role of political advisors had undermined the civil service and government.
Well, yes, I mean, the politicos have taken over in number 10. You know, when I was a private secretary and then when I was a principal private secretary, of course we had a political team, but we all worked together very closely. But actually, the principal private secretary was the top dog in number 10. Now the politicos have taken over, but I do actually think that reflects the way the world has changed. I don't think it's made it better.
Vernon, do you want to say anything on that one?
Yes, I think too many of the political advisors are really spin doctors in disguise, and they're doing work which junior ministers should be able to do to look at opinion in the grassroots and see how opinion is moving. It seems to me in the period that Robin Butler was private secretary to Heath, spin doctors were there, political advisors were there with some sort of expertise. For example, I think in the previous Labour government you had Brian Abel Smith, who was a great expert on the hospital system. And political advisors, it seems to me, can supplement the work of civil servants. On the whole, civil servants seems to me are experts on the subjects they're dealing with. They've got or should have a kind of doctorate in their knapsack on the subject they're dealing with, but they haven't necessarily got the historical background, and that goes back to what I said earlier about critically examining the assumptions on which you're working, and they won't necessarily have a comparative background. For example, how does the health service work in France or Germany or other countries? There, I think special advisors could do a great deal of good, but I think too many of them now are just propagandists for the government, which no sensible government should need.
And I think there's an assumption that they know things which they don't necessarily. I mean, I do remember before I was with Ken Clarke at the Treasury as an office junior, I was there with Norman Lamont, and David Cameron was one of the political advisors, and we had a lot of fun together, but I don't think either of us knew very much, and mostly we agreed with the last person we'd met. That was genuinely what went on. So,
David Cameron, whom I tutored, was very deceptive and, like a good Etonian, did not show how much he knew and often shammed that he knew a lot less than he actually did.
That shows you the difference between David and me. He appeared to know nothing. I really knew nothing. But I think our advice was equally offered, and we meant well. Any more questions? We've got time for 2 or 3 more. Yes, we have a distinguished, Michael Mates is here in the front row, and I think someone's... Oh, well, we'll take a question back there first, and then we'll come to you, Michael. We'll get somebody on skates to come down the...
Thank you. John Kirkham, a retired surgeon. Can you tell us, Mr. Clarke, about what you intend to do to help things in the present day politically? Because it seems to me that political language, which George Orwell said was designed to make lies sound feasible and murder sound respectable, is largely to blame. I've noticed over the years that on the wards, for instance, whereas in the 1970s the ward sisters and the nurses, if something had gone wrong, they'd ask you honestly, they'd speak to you honestly and admit things. Nowadays, they don't. Everyone evades the issue all the time. Do you think this is a big thing that needs putting right? I feel it does.
He's saying everyone is evading the issue now. The political newspeak is to say things that may not necessarily be true. What is your solution? What is the way forward in a nutshell from you? Can't look back now. You've got to look forward. What's to be done?
Well, we've got to get back to the position I strongly agree with Robin Butler should be the position of government. That the main objective of government should be to deliver the national interest, in their opinion, to make a difference in areas where you need to make a difference, and to bear in mind that during their period of office, their aim is to hand over a country which in some ways is better than when they found it, in their opinion, and is poised to meet the problems of the modern world, and that overrides everything else. Next week's headlines, opinion polls, don't matter. Margaret never read opinion polls, so she would do a bit of campaigning sometimes. He certainly took notice of them when forming policy. She never read a newspaper, until you got near to election time. And her convictions, just as Ted was driven by his convictions, determined what you did. And they would have got their reward, and Margaret did get her reward in elections, when the public judged at the end of 3 or 4 years, however unpopular some of the policies had been, And all Margaret Thatcher's policies were unpopular with the public at the time, who always wanted us to settle every strike and were against privatizing anything. And she got an ever-increasing electoral reward when people reluctantly conceded it had worked and things were getting better. And a government now needs, because it is what politics is for, to produce a government that takes tough and difficult and necessary decisions and doesn't just regard itself as accountable to the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph, realises it's got to live within the constraints of parliamentary accountability and live within the constraints of an unwritten constitution and produce results by making the right decisions on difficult things. That is a million miles away from the approach of government which has developed in the last 20 years. It hasn't started with Boris. It's been going on for quite a long time. And the public, who have got increasingly cynical, have got to start, as an electorate, voting for serious, sensible politicians who appear to have the right motives, take us back to a proper system of government, where the expertise of the civil service is properly harnessed and used, as Robin has said, and where you don't go herring off after a sort of, latest fancy, as Gyles has said, certainly not in economic policy. So this state of affairs is bad. It's not just here, it's across every Western democracy. There's no Western democracy working properly. The public in most Western democracies are attracted by theatrical figures, polarized views, simplistic answers to what, unfortunately, in the modern world are usually complicated problems which require quite complicated answers. Traditional parties of the broad left and the broad right are slowly vanishing. The public have got to find a new political leadership. Somebody's got to emerge who can epitomize the good government approach to government that should dominate all else, and not just the hiring a lot of Irks in number 10 to handle the briefing behind the scenes of the press, the leaking against colleagues, and the attempts to organize a good headline in tomorrow morning's newspapers, which are too often the priority today. And I think Ted Heath, who didn't actually produce a great deal of success outside Europe, we weren't a terribly good government in the end, largely through making the wrong economic choices and overwhelmed by events from the outside world. But he adopted the right principle, and he did. He was guided above all else by what he firmly believed was the national interest and good government, and would not have been deflected by some public relations man saying he'd got to say something in response to a focus group or an opinion poll.
I did want... Yeah, well, no. If you're launching a campaign, I think tonight's the night, because they're here. They're here for you.
Oh, I've had enough of those.
I once interviewed Ted Heath and asked him to name, it's a rather challenging question, the 10 prime ministers of his lifetime that he thought were the most impressive. And he began by saying, present company accepted? I said, yes. And I'd chosen 10 because I knew I wouldn't be able to avoid him at least naming Margaret Thatcher, speaking the name out loud. And he went through this list. He began courteously. Well, I don't think he began with John Major, but John Major was up there. He went through all the prime ministers, basically, that he could think of, and he was on to number 9. And still he had not, he'd done Clement Attlee. He'd said Alec Douglas-Home was much underrated. Jim Callaghan actually had his moments. He'd gone through all of them. He could not bring himself to say the words Margaret Thatcher. We're on to the 10th most impressive British prime minister since the war. And I said, you've got to name the 10th. He said, I know what you're trying to do. I know what you're trying to do. And he then named the Prime Minister of Belgium. Michael, you have a question.
My question is looking forward as well, but specifically about the European issue. because it seems to me we're at an impasse at the moment when nothing is happening to put right the wrongs, and the Brexiteers are saying, well, what we did was right and everything that's happened since is wrong. The Remainers are saying it's all the fault of Brexit that it's gone wrong the way that it has. There seems to be a remarkable lack of political leadership right across the board. And I wonder what the panel thinks is the sort of leadership that we require to take us forward, either to make it better, to make it softer, as Ken has said, or to deal with what we've got to and get on with the situation we're in. But in any case, it seems to me we simply can't go on like we are.
Vernon, what does history tell us? What Michael is saying is we simply can't go on like we are. What kind of leadership do we need to look for now? And I think Ken, in a sense, was trying to answer that. What does history tell us there?
History tells us there's a reaction against the sort of government we've got now. There was one in 1970 when Heath was elected, which I think was in part a reaction against the frivolity, I suppose you might call it, of Harold Wilson's government. And there was in 1922 when Lloyd George was overthrown, and Baldwin played a leading part in that. And he said of Lloyd George that he had a morally disintegrative effect on everyone who came into contact with him. I draw no comparisons. And he said the Lloyd George cabinet was a thieves' kitchen. And there was a reaction against that kind of government to a more honest sort of government in the 1920s. So I think we can be hopeful about that. I wonder if this is the last question. I can make 2 points about the Heath government, which will modify some of the criticisms I made earlier. The first was that he was enormously unlucky. We entered Europe when there was a 4-fold increase in oil prices, and the 30 glorious years were coming to an end. I think no government would have found it easy to deal with that. The second point was that he shared the assumptions of his age. He was a victim, in a sense, of the economists and social scientists who were overconfident and mostly got things completely wrong, a victim of the establishment, if you like. The Times criticised him not for trying to expand too much, but for doing too little. They said he ought to expand even faster in the 1972 budget. And I think far too much is made in the Heath government of criticisms of his personality, because his cabinet was extraordinarily cohesive. There were no resignations at all on policy. And when I think Conservatives, many do now, when they belittle him, they also belittle themselves. He was a man of great integrity who tried to achieve many important things and was supported at the time by many who later became his critics. And I think the moral is much more difficult than simply blaming Heath. It's that a government requires a willingness to question the assumptions of the day in the face of changing realities. And I think this is where the Heath government went down. It's a very difficult moral to put into practice, easy to formulate, not easy to put it into practice.
I'm going to allow, I've been told we can, one last question, and I'd like it to be from a lady, if there is one, only because I don't want to replicate totally Lord Butler's number 10 as entirely male-dominated. But we are all one here, of course. Yes? There was a lady who had a question.
Oh, hello.
Yes, I thought there was.
Hi, my name's Sally Ty, and I'm lucky enough to teach history at Salisbury Sixth Form College. I'm here with a load of students, and this is the period that we teach. You have answered this question a little bit, but my students would love some quotes for their coursework. We have to teach the Heath government 1970 to 74, and the question is, how successful was Heath? Now, the textbooks really paint him in a really bad light as a huge failure. You've kind of said his only real success was Europe, but do you think he was a complete failure? Do you think there are other areas of success?
Very interesting question, and a great question to end on. I'm going to give the final word to Ken. Bear in mind that Ted is here beneath a light, listening to us from beyond, so we're not going to categorize him as a complete failure. Far from it. From a personal point of view, I think he was a great man and a good man, and somebody who, as it were for us, was an inspiring figure when we were young people. And he inspired us because of his experience. It's been mentioned in the 1930s, but whenever I talked to him about Europe, he always began with a story about the Second World War. That for him was what it was all about, creating peace, genuine peace in our time by bringing the countries of Europe together so there could never be another horror as there had been during the Second World War. So I would say to your students that never mind what history says, his views, his philosophy was far from a failure. It was an inspiration for success. But let's take each of you in turn. How would you assess Ted 50 years after, literally to the day you first walked into number 10? Begin with you, Robin.
I think he laid the foundations, despite the fact that his own premiership ended badly. He laid the foundations for what was a great improvement in the 1980s and the 1990s.
Very good. Vernon?
Well, I fear that he showed that the post-war settlement, if you like to call it that, which had been forged in the war and the Churchill coalition, then by the Attlee government, could really no longer work.
Very good. And Ken, your final verdict.
I agree with Robin. I think he succeeded in paving the way for what came after. He was the first person who realized a need to address what was Britain's role in the world, in post-war world. How were we going to maximize our political influence, defend our interests, and provide the right setting for our economy? And he also tried to address what changes need to be made in order to achieve that. And Europe was an attempt to spell out where modern Britain was going to be, and to him and to his generation, to bring to an end the era of dreadful European wars over the previous century. That mattered enormously to all his contemporaries, because it had become so dreadful in the two world wars of the 20th century, and give us a new role. And he did try to create a new, more prosperous, socially aware Britain. The Industrial Relations Act that we passed, trying to modernize the law around trade unions, was not too severe. It wasn't as tough as Margaret Thatcher's was 10 years later, eventually, but it was an attempt to get back some order, and it was balanced by all his attempts at a more social justice, which, with hindsight, we can see were wrong. The pouring money into the economy and all the rest of it, and what we would now regard as rather misguided fiscal policy at a time when the oil crisis particularly was already creating inflationary pressures for us. But the agenda he set himself was a very wise and broad one. Bad luck, I think. Events, dear boy, which always determine things, actually in the end meant it had limited success as a government, but the agenda was the one that eventually had to be tackled, and was tackled in the 1980s, only after the winter of discontent had brought to an end a period of obvious calamity that made radical solutions more possible.
Ladies and gentlemen, Robin Butler, Vernon Bogdanor, and Kenneth Clarke, thank you so much. Well done. Spot on.
Gyles, thank you. I'd now like to ask the Honourable Sara Morrison, who is a very close friend of Edward Heath, to come up and say a few words of thanks to our speakers. Sara.
Like many of you here, God, there are a lot of you when one looks round, aren't there? And I've awaited the massive treat we've just enjoyed since it was COVID postponed 12 months ago. And so much, I'm sure you agree with me, much of their collective back to the future wisdom and experience has even more poignant punch right now in the glare of our current domestic political scenery than it might have had even as little as 12 months ago. When ordered by Arundels, I stress the word ordered, to pick up the privilege or penance of saying thank you on behalf of us all to this platform crammed with admired talents, experience, real knowledge, and highly regarded records of honourable public service, I considered pleading my vast antiquity, they're mere children to me, in order to wallow in their wisdom unfussed by the inevitably inadequate attempt to convey our appreciation, particularly as I was told to be brief and to swallow all personal opinions. That's quite hard, as I can remember Ken, Lord Clarke, as a new youthful MP, back in the currently ever more often called to mind, and until this afternoon, often misinterpreted 70s, we all thought him quite promising then. It's comforting at my age to be proved to occasionally have been right. I'm terribly sorry to hear that he reckons his feet is a good excuse for not standing on platforms in the future using his mouth. I think we might have an argument about that later, because it seems to me he ought to continue sharing his wisdom for a little bit longer. He'll get his own back on me, I can feel it coming. As for the illustrious history professor, we've long been grateful admirers of his talent and output, giving historical shape and help to better comprehend sometimes opaque contemporary tribulations. Thank you, Vernon. Robin, Lord Butler's very presence is such a comforting reminder of the decades in which the United Kingdom's incorruptible, world-regarded, tried and trained administrative spine, the civil service, was marinated in public esteem the world over, whatever the politicians' vagaries or worse. One has to say both thank you and well done to Gyles Brandreth for being demobbed as a Member of Parliament and metamorphosizing, if there is such a word, isn't there, into a skilled reminder that humour is a vital wrapping for humanity and a necessary hotline to a sense of perspective or proportion in relation to life's quandaries and quagmires, all too often mislaid in this era of undereducated, unwary, unleashed digital universe. I suspect I'll have the agreement of you all joining me in thanking Arundels and their ever-vigilant and imaginative events team for giving Salisbury a hub of cerebral gatherings and happy opportunities to get together, to think, to laugh, and to hope. Ted would have been so very, very grateful. I thank them and today's enthralling speakers and all of you for joining in this, what to me was a notable and memorable occasion. Thank you, and thank them.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you could now move to the southern side of the cloisters for the drinks reception. There'll be 3 drink serving tables, so do move forward to the furthest so there's no delay in you being served. As you move through the south transept to the cloisters, that's behind me, to your right, you'll pass Edward Heath's ledger stone, which is highlighted with a spotlight, especially for this occasion. There's also the opportunity for you to visit the Magna Carta exhibition in the chapter house, if you have not already seen it. And you will see the chapter house on your left as you approach the drinks serving area. Please don't hesitate too long in moving to the cloisters, as the cathedral need to prepare for its evensong service. The cathedral staff tell me that if any of you wish to attend the service, you are indeed most welcome to do so, and the service starts at 5:30. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all from me, but a final thank you to Lord Clarke, Lord Butler, Vernon Bogdanor, and our excellent compere, Gyles Brandreth, and of course, Sara. Thank you.